Good morning and happy Sabbath, Valley Fellowship. As many of you know, this past week was our Teen Flag Camp week. And I just want to say on behalf of our Flag Camp leaders, staff, and campers, that it is such a privilege to be here to share with you today, and we thank you so much for all of you who support Flag Camp and make it a reality. We couldn't do it without you, and we are so grateful for that. So before we begin our presentation, I would like to share with you all a little bit about what our daily schedule was like for Flag Camp. The day would begin at about 9 in the morning with some icebreaker games, sort of to get us warmed up for the day. And following that, we would have our morning personal devotions, and during which we would look over some texts pertaining to our Flag Camp theme, Build on the Rock. And after our devotions, we would take a quick break before moving into our in-depth study of the book of Daniel. In this study, we covered Daniel chapter 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7. And after our study, we would sing some songs before splitting up into three groups and moving into there was three groups, one art group, one was canvassing, and one was presenting. So each of these groups had their respective activities. The canvassers would go out into Mount Jackson in the community and hand out the cards that Benjamin mentioned to us earlier, and also some baked goods some of the days. The art group worked on creating depictions of some of the scenes that we studied in the book of Daniel. And the presenting group, we prepared some of our teens that are going to share with us here in a bit about each of the, sort of a summary and some of the points that we can take away from each of the things that we studied on each of the days. Now, after that, we would have lunch, and following lunch, we would have some sort of afternoon activity. One day it was a game of kickball, and some other days we had groups of canvassers go out in the afternoon. And then after that, of course, we had our pool activities, which would either be free swimming for the teens, or one of the days we actually had a pool Olympics, which got quite competitive, but it was fun for everyone involved. And we would close out the day by getting in our study groups and asking the two famous questions, what did you like, what did you learn, and by closing out with prayer. Now, we are going to start our presentations, but before that, I want to explain the artwork that is going to be shown on the screen. So Jessa, who is the leader of the art team, she worked with our teens to create some art pieces. So for each of our presenters, there will be two pieces shown, one by one of the teens and one by Jessa, except for the fifth presenter. And our first presenter now is Marcel, and while he speaks, while he shares, we will see one piece done by Caden and one piece done by Jessa.
Good morning, happy Sabbath. My name is Marcel, and I will be speaking about Daniel chapter 1. But before we start, if you could take your Bibles and flip to Daniel chapter 1, verse 8. It says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's delicacies." What? "Nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So, have you ever had trials or hard times come to you? And during those hard times and trials, what have you done? How have you reacted? Have you blamed God? Or have you stayed and put your trust in him? There is one character in the Bible, Daniel, who had lots of hard times, starting with him being ripped away from his family, his home, and everything he knew and loved. I mean, that must have been so difficult for him. After he was ripped from his family and taken to Babylon, he was put in a program that Pastor Buzz likes to call the University of Babylon. There, he and his friends were offered all kinds of foods with unclean meats, wine, and stuff that we as Christians would not eat. And so Daniel and his friends purposed in their heart that, well, they wanted to stay true to God and obey him and obey his laws. So they went to the chief of eunuchs and asked them if they could eat vegetables and drink water for 10 days. And the chief of eunuchs said yes, and he put them on trial for 10 days. So 10 days go by, and then when he inspects the kids, the Babylonian kids, and Daniel and his friends appear to be much healthier than the Babylonian kids. And when the king sees them, he takes them to his court. They start working for the king. So, in other words, they were, when the hard times came, Daniel and his friends purposed in their heart that they would stay true to him, that they would put their trust in God. And we as Christians know that hard times and trials will come into our life. We will be tested, trialed, and it will be hard. But during those times, we need to put all our trust in God, keep obeying him. Because when those hard times come, if we obey God, blessings will come. Maybe not at the moment, maybe not in a month or a year, but those blessings will come. Amen. And, that can be shown because they were blessed, as we know in the rest of Daniel. You can see how the blessings came to Daniel and his friends for being truthful to God and all the situations they had when they were tested and trialed. And I have a question for you. When hard times come, are you putting your trust in God?
Thank you for sharing, Marcel. Let us always remember to purpose in our hearts, not to defile ourselves. Our next presenter will be Marcos. And on the screen, you will see artwork by Abigail and by Jessa.
Good morning, Happy Sabbath Church. So this week, they gave me the task to explain Daniel chapter 2. But before I start explaining, I want to give you guys a point that will help you understand more what I'm trying to say. And that point is that the Bible explains itself. Amen. And you guys will see this point as I go through the explanation. All right. So Daniel 2. Daniel 2, for me, is one of my favorite chapters in the Bible because it tells us the future. I'm going to tell you the story and everything. All right. So the story goes. King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, has a dream. And it's a dream that he's troubled by, but he doesn't know what it means. And he keeps having this dream night after night. And one day he just calls all the wise men, Chaldeans, and every single person that can communicate with the gods. And he tells them, I want you guys to interpret my dream and say it to me because I have forgotten the dream. So all the Chaldeans, wise men, can't do it because it's just impossible for just a human being without God be able to do something like that. It's impossible. So the king gets very mad. He thinks that they're always tricking him and lying to him. And he decides to kill all the wise men that are in Babylon. And as you guys know, as Marcel said, Daniel has just graduated from the University of Babylon. And he was one of those wise men. So when they come just to take him and kill them, he asks, why is this happening? And then they explain him, the king has made this decision to kill everyone because they can't interpret his dream. So what Daniel does is he asks for him to go to the king. And when he gets to the king, he asks for the king for time. So he can interpret the dream and interpret the dream. So Daniel goes home. And instead of being worried or stressed, he goes to sleep. Which, personally, I would not have done that. And he prays to God. He tells his friends for advice. And that night, God answers his prayers. God shows him the dream. And the next morning, Daniel goes to the king and says, King, the Lord has shown me your dream and its interpretation. So I will tell it to you. And this is what he says. The head of gold. Wait, let me start again. In the dream, you saw a great statue, like the one we see on the screen, which, good job, Abigail, it's a pretty good drawing. And Jessa, my bad, but yours is too. I'm sorry. He said, the head of gold that you saw represents your kingdom, represents Babylon, powerful and rich. And remember the point I gave you guys at the beginning, the Bible explains itself? Well, we can find the connections in the same book of Daniel, in the Daniel chapter 2, verse 38. The next part of the statue, like the arms and chest, is silver. And Daniel says to the king, this represents another kingdom, powerful, that will be given the power to eat flesh, which means destroy. And this kingdom is Middle Persia. Where do we find this? Or where can we find connections? Daniel 5:31. Bronze, or should I say the belly and thighs. Bronze represented Greece. This kingdom was given the power to destroy quickly, and it was very powerful. Daniel 8:5 gives us proof about Greece. Iron, the legs. Well, the legs represented Rome, the most powerful kingdom that this statue shows. It was given the power to destroy everything that came on its way, and it was the longest kingdom to be on the earth, at least at that time. And then we find this in Daniel 9:25. And if you guys want to go read it, then you can. Then we got a very interesting combination, shall we say it? Iron and clay. But as you guys all know, the iron and clay don't work or mix. But what this means is Europe, or should I say dividing kingdoms, modern Europe. We find this in Daniel 2:43. And finally, Daniel tells the king, and in your dream, a rock came from heaven, not carved by hand, hit the statue on his feet and destroyed it. It went crumbling down, and the wind blew away the dust. That rock represents heaven. Heaven will come, destroy sin, and like in the dream, become a great mountain. That kingdom will never be removed and will last forever. And we find this in Daniel chapter 2:48. I don't know about you guys, but I want to be part of that kingdom. So my question for you this morning, are you ready for what will happen in the latter days? And you'll be part of that group that will be able to be in God's kingdom forever.
Thank you, Marcos, for those inspiring words. Let us always be wary of Bible prophecy and also wary of the fact that it is confirmed that the Bible confirms itself and that history also is confirmed in these prophecies. Now, our next presenter is Christopher, and the artwork that will be shown is by Josiah and by Jessa.
Good morning. My name is Christopher Hoffman, and so today I will be talking about Daniel chapter 3. So a theme that Daniel chapter 3 has is that God's people will be tested, and that will result in crisis and their deliverance. So a verse that says this is Daniel chapter 6, verse 26 and 27, which says, "For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and earth." So in Daniel chapter 3, it like has somewhat of a pattern. And so in verse 4 and 6, there's a decree. And the decree is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego should worship the golden image. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 6, there's a threat. And the threat is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be thrown into the fiery furnace. So, their faithfulness is when they refuse to worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar made, which is in Daniel chapter 3, verse 18. So, then they are accused for not worshiping the image in Daniel, the verse 12. So, then they proclaim their faith by saying that God will protect them no matter what. And that is in verse 16 and 17. Then they are punished for not worshiping the statue. So they are thrown into their fiery furnace in verse 20 and 23. So then they are delivered by Jesus, and who came down and saved them and stood with them in the fiery furnace. And in verse 25, they are delivered by in verse 29, King Nebuchadnezzar makes a confession saying that their God is the only true God. Then there's a decree which King Nebuchadnezzar decrees that everybody should worship Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. So, a point of this chapter is that if you stand up for what is right and what is true, you will stand out from everyone else around you. And so a question that I have for you is that, are you standing up for the truth?
Thank you, Christopher, for those insightful comments. Let us apply these stories to our lives. When we face trials and tribulations, we know that if we turn to God, He will surely deliver us. Our next presenter is Naomi, and the artwork that will show up on the screen is by Daniel and by Jessa.
Good morning, Valley Fellowship. As Linton said, my name is Naomi, and I will be speaking from Daniel chapter 7. If you would turn there with me, because I'll be reading a couple verses from there. So when I was younger, I used to draw all sorts of animals with wings and horns, and I never realized that some of them were a part of Daniel's dream. So I'm going to tell you about them so you know, just in case you see your children drawing some animals. So the first verse is Daniel 7:4, and it says, "The first was a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it." So it was very unique because it was standing on 2 legs. I didn't draw it with 2 legs, I drew it with 4. But in this case, it represents the golden head, which is Babylon, like Marco said. And so this is the first part of the statue. The second animal was a bear, and what's interesting about it is it had 3 ribs in its mouth. And the 3 ribs, in this case, represented 3 overthrown kingdoms, which were Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. The beast represents Medo-Persia and is the silver part of the statue. And this all ties in with chapter 2, which Marco spoke about. The third beast was a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. And it symbolizes Greece, and which is the belly thighs, which is bronze. And the fourth beast is a very interesting creature. It is a dreadful beast. It has iron teeth and bronze claws. And it's very easy to remember now, which Linton told me about, which is the iron teeth and the iron part of the statue, which is Rome. So it's easy to remember the materials. So you can remember. And then the next part, which was, what's the word? Yes. And it has 10 horns, and the 10 horns represent 10 kings. How I learned to remember this was your feet, you have 10 toes, 10 horns, 10 kings, just ties all in. And what's different about this one horn, it's a smaller horn, and it has the face of a man, and it's speaking pompous words against the saints of the Most High, which it says in verse 8. And it will say, "And I was considering the horns. There was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them, before whom 3 first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words." And the next 2 is the ancient days, which it talks about. "I watched till thrones were put in place, and the ancient days were seated, and his garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. A fiery steam issued and came forth before him. 1,000 thousands ministered to him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened." The final part of the statue is the stone, which is God's kingdom. And right now we are at the feet, and we're being pressured by just society today, and we have to be ready for when God comes. So are you understanding God's word and letting it speak to you?
Thank you, Naomi, for sharing with us about these prophecies that are very important. And it's important to remember that God wants us to be in the know of what will happen in the latter days. So let us dig deep in his word to find the answers. Our last presenter will be Benjamin, and he's going to share with us a little bit more about some of the things that happen later in Daniel chapter 7. And the last art piece that accidentally was shown for a second is by Jessa.
I don't like using the podium, if you remember from last time. But, okay, so first thing I like to mention is there was a fella named Charles that was at our flag camp. My little brother Johnny and his girlfriend are here today. And from what Pastor Reed tells me, there's a handful of people that are new to this church. And that being said, welcome to Valley Fellowship, Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I just want to mention this because I very much wish I could see inside their mind. And I want to take a moment and try to imagine reading Daniel chapter 7, reading Daniel chapter 2 for the first time. Now, the majority of the kids that we had were grown-up Adventists, but Charles, he had, I think Alexis Mace had actually brought him to the church, invited him to come to flag camp, and he came. And he came for one day, and he actually came yesterday, was his second day. So he came for our study of Daniel 7, which is a pretty deep thing to jump into. But just reading this for the first time, God paints these images that are very cryptic, that are very mythical. And I think our artist Jessa can see the beauty into it, but he paints this image, this very confusing image that has all these symbols and whatnot. And what us Adventists believe is we use, as Marcos had mentioned earlier, one of the rules we use for interpreting Bible prophecy is we allow the Bible to explain itself. And by allowing the Bible to explain itself, we can understand these mythical, these cryptic symbols that it is presenting to us. Now, Jessa, can you please, I want to make sure everybody's paying attention and understanding what is being said. Can you please turn back to the Daniel 2 image? Yeah, that's good. Okay, I want to see a show of hands. Where do you guys think we are at in this image? Because as Marcos mentioned, this is a history event line. So, are we in the golden head? Are we in the chest of silver? Are we in the bronze? Are we in the iron legs? Are we in the feet with miry clay mingling with iron? Yes. So what is the next thing that is going to happen? It is the stone that destroys the image and creates this mountain, the everlasting kingdom. So we are very near to the fulfillment, the complete fulfillment of this prophecy. And now Naomi just beautifully explained for us part of Daniel chapter 7. Another one of the rules that we used for interpreting Bible prophecy is the Bible often has this pattern of repetition and turn back to the image that was up while Naomi was speaking. Naomi. The Daniel 7 image. Yes. So Daniel 2 gives us this plot line, these kingdoms that history shows, history and prophecy, they agree. So the head was Babylon, the chest was the Medes and the Persians, the bronze was the Greece, and iron was Rome. And Daniel chapter 7 is a perfect example of repetition and enlargement because these all represent the same exact kingdoms if we allow the Bible to explain itself and look at history. This lion represents Babylon, and how it enlarges upon the gold from Daniel chapter 2 is it was standing upon two legs, and the wings were plucked up from the lion. Now, wings represent the quickness of the advancing of a kingdom. Now, towards the end, we read that Nebuchadnezzar, the lion, had a heart of man. Nebuchadnezzar had a conversion experience, and his heart was softened, and the kingdom slowed down towards the end of its reign. And when the Medes and the Persians, represented by this bear, took over, and the bear has the three ribs in its mouth, there's the enlargement there. The Medes and the Persians were often at war against the three provinces, the Babylonians and Egypt and Libya, as Naomi had mentioned. And then we have this leopard. The leopard has four wings, and there's the example of the enlargement. As I mentioned before, the wings represent the had a kingdom advanced as quickly as the Greeks did. I remember learning in history class about great Alexander, and he quickly conquered lots of territory. But then Mr. Marcel talked about earlier, not a lot, purposing in our heart to not defile ourselves with the king's food, and that is exactly what Alexander had did. So unfortunately, he did not read Daniel chapter 1. But then we go to the next image. Terrible beast with 10 horns. And I'm going to be elaborating on this little horn. Now, the little horn. Let's turn to Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, and read that again. So I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. Behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, a mouth speaking great things. So it gives us this symbol, this horn. Now, what exactly do the horns represent? Again, allow the Bible to explain itself. If we turn to Daniel chapter 7, verse 24, it explains it for us. And it reads, "And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise." Now, kings. The horn represents kings. Let's put this into a little bit more modern language. So at the time, the form of government that they had was a monarchy, a king, as it mentions. If we can modernize this we obviously do not have a monarchy anymore. We have a democracy. So the horn represents a political power. The horn represents a political power. And so what this political power does, going back to verse 8, reads, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns plucked up by the roots. So again, here's expansion upon Daniel chapter 2, because in Daniel chapter 2, you have the feet with the miry clay. And the clay, the feet, has 10 toes. Notice again, we have 10 horns here, representing the divided kingdoms. If you look at history, again, history and prophecy, they agree. God says what's going to happen, and it happens. And so the 10 toes, the 10 horns represent the 10 political powers that Rome had kind of created and branched out. And so I'm not going to mention them all, but I will mention 3 because they're important. This little horn he didn't want to just take a place just as the 11th horn. He felt the need to usurp the place of 3 other horns. And those 3 horns were the Huruli, the Vandals, the next one, my favorite one, it's a fun one to say, the Ostrogoths. So the Huruli, the Vandali, and the Ostrogoths. These are the places, or the political powers that the little horn usurped, took the place of. And if we look at history, the political power that eradicated those 3 political powers was papal Rome. This is looking at history and comparing Bible prophecy to history. This is what it is saying. So let's now turn to verse 25. And it's going to give us a little bit more insight into this little horn. And it reads, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High." Remember, the little horn had a mouth, had eyes to speak these great words. "And shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and to think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time." So what I want to first focus on is that part where it says he will think to change times and laws. Now we have to ask ourselves, why does the Bible feel it is important? Why did God, the Holy Spirit, inspire Daniel to write this down? Because whenever another political power, whenever another kingdom takes over another kingdom, obviously they're going to think to do things their own way. They're not going to continue how it already was. But the Holy Spirit thought it was important enough for him to mention that it will think to change times and laws. What times and laws is it talking about? God's law. Let's turn to Galatians chapter 5, and it is verse 14. Galatians chapter 5, verse 14. And it reads, "For all the law is fulfilled in one word." One word, but then he proceeds to give us an entire sentence. It says, "All the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Now, the key word in that sentence is love. So the entire law is summed up into one word, which is love. Math here, if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C. Turn to chapter 4, verse 9. Or no, verse 8, sorry. And I think this is one that hope we've all read before. It reads, "He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love." So, the law equals love equals. So then, the law must equal God. In this political power, papal Rome will think to change the character of God. So the time we look at God's law, and there's only one commandment, as us Adventists know, that involves time, which is the 4th commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. And if we look at history, if we study this political power, papal Rome, this is something that they did. They transferred the solemnity of the Sabbath day to Sunday and made it the Lord's day, and they no longer honor the true Sabbath day. And now I'd like to turn and I had a plan for what I was going to wrap this up with, but as I observed everybody else speaking, I think I'm going to make a appeal on something else. But first, let's turn to Revelation chapter 13. And if we look, we can see repetition and enlargement. Another instance of repetition, because chapter 13 is using lots of similar language, and if we diligently study, use some scholarmanship, we can see that it has the exact same time prophecy, although it is using different language. So in Revelation chapter 7, it mentioned a time, times, and half a time. Revelation chapter 13 mentions the 42 months. And they both mention that, in Daniel 7, it mentioned that he will wear out the saints of the Most High. And my friend Daniel here, I'm so glad he mentioned John Huss before he played that song, because that was the time when the saints were being worn out. That's the time it was referring to, this time, times, and half a time. John Huss was one of the reformers. And so, okay, let's see here. Let's read verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. So this is giving more insight into the little horn. It's enlarging a little bit. Name is often synonymous with character. It had the character of blasphemy upon its mind. And let's keep going here. Let me go down to verse 3. I'm going to read verse 3. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after that beast. So if we study the time prophecy, the time, times, and half a time represents a year. Time represents a year. And if we use the Bible to explain itself, we can look at Ezekiel 4:6 and Numbers chapter 14, verse 34, to learn that when referring to Bible prophecy, one day equals 1 year. So 1 year, there's 365 days. If we do the math, 365 times, well, actually, a biblical year is 360 days. So if we do the math, the time, times, and half a time is 1,260 days. So do the translation to the biblical prophecy time, that is 1,200. Okay. Is that better? Okay, sorry. Thank you, Jessa. And so if we look again, history and prophecy agree. We look at history, and this little horn is the papal power, the Vatican, papal Rome. We look at history, and from 538 AD to 1798 AD was the reign of this Catholic power. And in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte eradicated the Vatican. He captured the Pope, and they were done. But going back to Revelation chapter 13, verse 3, and I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. So, as Marcos's point was made, God tells us what is going to happen in the latter days. This political power that will think to change times and laws, that will think to change God's character of selfless love, will be healed and will return. Now, that is just a very condensed, I'm no Daniel connoisseur like my friends Pastor Buzz and Pastor Reed, but I do want to make an appeal. Where is Colin Dower? Can you please come up here? Sorry to surprise you, man, but this dude, he was really into the studies the entire time. And as I'm sitting here watching all these kids preach to us, a psalm came to my mind. And it is Psalm chapter 127. Let me turn there real quick. Psalm chapter 127. And I'm going to be looking at verse 4. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. This entire week we have been digging into Bible prophecy. It is a privilege for us to have this information, have this light, to have this understanding. And as we talked about earlier, these things seem so cryptic to the rest of the world. To have this understanding, Buzz can give many testimonies of him going to other churches and preaching. This is power that we have. Let us not glance over it. Now, yesterday, my friend Colin, we had our devotion was on 1 Kings chapter 18, I believe, and it is a story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. And Colin, do you remember the question that you asked me? That was your appeal for that devotional. I remember you talked about how Elijah, there was how many, over 300 prophets of Baal, and Elijah was the only one. How many was it?
450.
450 prophets of Baal. Do you remember the question that you asked me?
Yes. Will you be that one person to stick up for what is right?
Colin looked at me and asked me, do I want to be that one person? If we look at every single Reformation, with John Huss, he wasn't the first one, but if we look at every single Reformation, they can all be traced back to one person. As the story was with Elijah, he was the only one. And this question has been rolling around my head a lot. Do I want to be that one person? And now I make the appeal to the youth. Guys, you have done an excellent job today. Good job. And I'm very proud of you. Again, I will read 127, verse 4. As arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of the youth. You guys are our weapons. You guys are the ones that will finish the work. Will you be that one person?